On the 9th of April 1949, two incidents in a single day at Somerset's Wookey Hole Caves had seemed to cast doubt over the whole future of further exploration of that site by diving. Bob Davis found that the only way on beyond Chamber 11 plunged deeper underwater than their oxygen rebreathers could safely take them. Further progress seemed impossible. Then, hours later, the death of the highly experienced wartime frogman Gordon Marriott underlined the enormous dangers of what they were undertaking. The very future of the cave diving group seemed to hang in the balance. Yet this underground, underwater world that they had entered had an enormous yet strange appeal. Peak Cavern in Derbyshire was one of a number of sites throughout Britain where they felt that cave diving might lead to new discoveries. A couple of 100 metres from the large cave mouth, a stream emerges from a low arch in the valley bottom. How this stream related to the passages in the known cave was something of a mystery. Davis and Coase hoped they might solve that mystery. These flooded passages that they called sumps seemed like locked doors into the unknown. Now, using frogman equipment developed for the war, they seemed to have the key. Davis and Coase were not just exploring an underwater passage, but also evolving the techniques for this new and precarious activity. The use of fins was a relatively new and many thought dangerous development for cave divers. They found that fins allowed them to move more quickly than bottom walking. They were now able to keep ahead of the cloud of silt which rose behind them and reduce the visibility to zero in seconds. At first they followed a line that they'd laid the previous year, but when they found it buried under the mud, they continued without it. They realised that if they slowed down, the ensuing mud cloud would quickly overwhelm them. Now, without any form of safety line, they had little choice other than to continue. Thankfully, after a dive of only 17 minutes, they emerged safely in a pool, which they knew was in the known cave. Had they been forced to stop or to return, they would have become hopelessly lost in the thickest of underwater fogs. They knew they were lucky to survive. It was a lesson well learned. Diving without a line would henceforth be outlawed within the cave diving group. In spite of the previous incidents, Wookey Hole remained the spiritual base of the cave diving group. The intriguing darkness beyond the limit of exploration was always at the back of their minds. Here, further progress had been stopped, where the passage plunged beyond their depth limit on oxygen at Chamber 11. Then in 1955, a new possibility emerged. Davis managed to acquire a new type of diving apparatus developed by a Frenchman, Jacques Cousteau. They called it an aqualung. It used compressed air instead of oxygen, and thus avoided their previous problems of oxygen narcosis below 30 feet. There was now a possibility they could pass Chamber 11. However, there were safety concerns about this new radical development, particularly if the new diving set were to be used in conjunction with fins. For safety, it was decided that Buxton and Wells, both bottom walking with oxygen sets, would accompany Davis to the lip of Chamber 11. They would lay the safety line that far, as it was feared that a free-swimming diver might easily become entangled. Arriving at the lip, Davis indicated that he would make a short reconnaissance. Swimming deeper, he was able to see the way on. In deteriorating visibility, he then returned to tie his safety line to theirs. This done, he indicated that he would set off to explore further. Emerging into somewhat clearer water upstream, he now seemed to make good progress. Suddenly there was a problem with his afflow. The box had come apart and jammed the reel which paid out the safety line. Even worse, the jerk on his line seemed to have pulled the knot undone which connected his line to Buxton's. He felt his breathing tighten. The bottle from which he was breathing was empty. He opened the valve, bleeding half of the air from the full bottle into the empty bottle, and then closed it again. He now knew half of his air was already gone. He tried in the poor visibility to locate his friends, but without success. The growing anxiety while trying to deal with his problems was now causing Davies to overbreathe. It made him more buoyant. He floated towards the roof, becoming increasingly disorientated. His instinct was to head for clearer water, and so he found himself heading upstream. Passing the deepest part of the sump, the roof was rising. He instinctively sensed there might be an air surface ahead, and kept going. To his enormous relief, he saw a mirrored surface above him, and made for it. A shaken Davies surfaced in a new, unknown chamber, very grateful to be alive. But in truth, his problems had just begun. Meanwhile, Buxton and Wells, thinking Davies had somehow passed above them, had returned to Chamber 9. Now, realising their mistake, they returned to start a search. Davies, having hauled himself out of the water, was full of thought. For the moment he was safe, but he knew that nobody on the planet was capable of reaching him. While Buxton and Wells, with growing despair, searched as far as they were able, Davies was sitting on a ledge above the water, making critical calculations upon the slate of his afflow. It was 24 minutes past midnight. The aqualung was his only means of survival. But did he have enough air? It got to 3 a.m. In Chamber 3, the base control team were also very anxious when at last they saw lights emerging from the water. News was not good. They set about raising the alarm, but without much hope. Even the Navy were not trained in aqualung diving at this stage, let alone cave diving. Davies, meanwhile, had analysed both his air supply and his predicament. His only chance of making it was a clear run, with not a single hesitation or mistake. After waiting 3 hours for the visibility to clear, he was ready to make a run for it. Now it was life or death. It needed the utmost self-control. He desperately needed to stay calm and swim steadily, while knowing his air supply might run out at any minute. Suddenly, almost at the same time, his air supply showed signs of running out and his afflo jammed a second time. In a last desperate bid to survive, Davies abandoned his afflo, which was also his only light source, and swam frantically in utter darkness. Amazingly, on his last breath of air, he broke surface. He had reached chamber 9. Here awaited not only his emergency torch, but also a spare oxygen set. He knew that now he could retrieve his afflo and make the final dive to safety. The controllers in Chamber 3 were waiting for the rescue team when they saw Davies' light emerge from the water. It was 5 a.m. They had been certain he was dead. His first words became famous in cave diving circles. "The devil," he said, "is a gentleman." But the day's events had hardened the attitude of the cave diving group against air diving and fins. The early 60s saw a growth in the interest in caving. In 1962, on the slopes of Ingleborough in the Yorkshire Dales, a small group headed towards a mostly vertical cave known as Hardrawkin Pot. They carried the new lightweight wire and aluminium ladders, and most significantly, bottles of compressed air. The spearhead of this group was a strongly motivated and rather rebellious individual called Mike Boone.
The problem is that cave diving had got a bit fixed in its ways. It was convinced that oxygen was the only way to go for cave diving, and it was resistant to the introduction of air for short duration diving. At the same time, logically, there was just no argument. The only way forward for short sumps was air.
26 cubic foot compressed air bottles, known as tadpoles, were now becoming readily available, and tobacco clubs were springing up all over the country. A series of vertical drops takes Hardrawkin Pot to a depth of 200 feet, but the water that cascades down these shafts was known to emerge over 3/4 of a mile away and 400 feet below the entrance. It was in places like this that Boone felt air diving was the only way forward. With up to 25 minutes of air in a single bottle, he felt that it was enough to see if a short dive might open the way into major new sections of undiscovered cave passage. At the bottom he checked his equipment. His breathing valve was of a new design, which seemed much more suitable for cave diving than the classic twin hose type that Davies had used. A more robust threaded connection fastened it to the bottle via a longer and stronger high-pressure hose. It meant that the bottle, rather than being on his back, could be slung from his waist, where he had more chance of protecting it. Boone was in his standard caving gear. He carried no afflo. His only lamp was the caving light on his helmet. A lifeline tied round his waist would be paid out by his friend Mike Thompson. Boone had expected the sump to develop more or less horizontally. He was weighted for bottom walking. Instead, he found himself climbing underwater down a completely vertical drop. 18 feet down, the walls widened. and became too far apart to straddle. The drop continued into the darkness below him. Boone was forced to return. There would be no great discoveries today. Undeterred, Boone realised that the equipment itself was a great leap forward. In June of the same year, back in the Mendip Hills, he turned his attention back to Swildon's Hole, where cave diving had begun 13 years earlier. Since Balcombe and Shepherd had passed sumps 1 and 2, the cave diving group had passed 3 further sumps using oxygen equipment. Boone was on his way to sump 6, which he himself had managed to pass only the year before, using air. Steve Wynne Roberts and Mike Thompson had specially modified their oxygen sets and were now to try to join him through the restrictions of sump 6 to help him explore Swildon's 7.
Okay, Mike.
Mike Thompson would once again feed out the nylon lifeline. The sump was the lowest so far, a flat-out underwater squeeze and an interesting test for air versus oxygen. Pushing his bottle flat against his side, Boone was able to push forward. Most ordinary people would find that being in such a confined space above water would seem claustrophobic, but to do the same thing underwater needs a special sort of mentality, some might say madness. After 15 feet, Boone was once more in Swildon's 7, at the point he'd reached the year before. He felt his approach was fundamentally different to that of the cave diving group.
It was almost like sort of a theological argument between people who dived in caves to explore the sump and people who merely dived to get through the sump. I put myself squarely amongst the ranks of those who dived for as short a distance as possible to find a cave.
Half an hour later, his friends had managed to join him, and together they set off to explore the new Swildon 7 streamway. After several hundred feet of fine passage, just as hopes were rising of marching all the way to a connection with Wookey Hole, they reached sump 7. The following week, spurred on by success, Boone was back to attempt sump 7. Before the water muddied up, Mike had thought he could see some sort of air surface ahead. The way on underwater seemed to be shaped like an inverted T, barely big enough to squeeze through. Pushing his bottle in front of him, he was able to wriggle forward, his body now completely encased by the rock around him. After thrashing around for some while, he found the tightest of squeezes leading above it. Forcing his body up into it, his head broke surface into a small above-water cavity, too small to call a chamber. Boone assessed the situation. The way on was back underwater. He started to feel around with his feet.
Without really intending to push it, I started sort of drifting feet first into the sump. But the next conscious thought I had was that I am completely stuck. There I was, wedged in the sump. So I suppose after a certain time, panic started to take over.
When, at the height of his panic, Boone's mouthpiece pulled out, Boone considered whether it was worth putting it back.
I almost thought, shall I drown myself deliberately to end this kind of agony of being wedged here?
The instinct to survive prevailed. Boone then came aware of some space around his left hand. With all of his energy, he wriggled to move towards it, but he realised that he was now going away from base into unknown territory. Suddenly, he felt his hand break the water surface. With what little energy he had left, he writhed to force his body towards the precious air.
Eventually I ended up beyond the sump, having changed over from going feet first to head first, and on my back to on my front. So I'd done some incredible thrutching around in this rather tight sump, but then I got into Swildon's 8.
And so Boone became the first person to see the open passage of Swildon's 8. One can only imagine that at the time the excitement of the new discovery was somewhat tempered by the thought that he now faced the complete journey back through Sump 7 in reverse.
Well, I think I was pretty lucky not to have chopped it because I had gone in the wrong way around. I think the way to go into sumps is, with diving gear at any rate, is probably head first. I'd gone in feet first, face up, instead of head first, face down. I then pushed on in some kind of urge to get through the sump. And I then got stuck and started to panic. In fact, had panicked. And panic is not a survival-orientated mechanism in a cave sump. What can you say? I suppose the only thing is I was young and keen and slightly obsessed with the hopes of entering the master cave all the way to Wookie.
The next year, in August of 1963, a British cave diving exploit was to make international newspaper headlines. The location was the limestone plateau of the Vercors in the south of France. Here lay one of the world's great cave systems, the Gouffre Berger. In this cave in 1954, the French had reached a depth of over 1,000 metres, a world record. Leader of the British team, Ken Pearce, saw an opportunity and a challenge.
The Berger was the deepest in the world at the time. It finished in a siphon, and siphons were always a challenge to cave divers. It had been tackled by an international expedition, many countries strong, the Army, the Air Force, hundreds of thousands of pounds cost. We had to do it on a shoestring, and we did it with 12 people. All the separate countries, the Belgians, the Germans, the French, had all attempted to get down in a small party and failed. So we did a double challenge: one, get to the bottom and beat the others, and also get through the siphon. Well, we had a lot of trouble getting permission, really, because there'd been an accident, I think, the year before, and the French authorities had decided you must have insurance for an unlimited amount. Nobody would give insurance for an unlimited amount. So we said yes, we got insurance for an unlimited amount, and arranged to go down on the Monday. We left work on Friday night and drove down to the Berger, got there on Saturday night, and we started humping our equipment across the plateau, and we'd all got down the cave by Sunday morning without having seen the police or the authorities who wanted to check our insurance policy.
To reach the bottom with a small team, they would need to be underground for many days. With camping gear, food, tackle and diving equipment, everything would need to be ferried. It was a huge undertaking.
I had food for about 15 days. We had a holiday for 12 days, about 12 of which I could afford to be underground. We did use long working days. They were anything from 18 to 30 hours long. And the men, with there being no daylight and evening, the men didn't really know what was day and night.
and I managed to pinch a couple of days off them. I told them it was a day later than it really was. So when they were getting near the bottom and everybody was saying, well, we haven't time to get down and get to the sump, I pulled out my extra day out of the bag and said, oh yes, we have, we've got a spare day. The water disappears into a pool at the bottom of the Bergia, and it comes out at the caves of Sassenage, about 1.5 miles away and a few hundred feet deeper. So we knew there was a potential to make the cave even deeper if we could get through the siphon. So I went in on a heavy line, a caving line, in case the river went to a narrow passage, in which case there'd be a heavy current which I wouldn't be able to swim against, and the people who were paying out the line could have pulled me back if necessary.
Swam up to the surface and emerged in quite a large passage, again about 20 feet high and 20 feet wide and 100 feet high, something like that, which was quite exciting. It proved that it was a siphon and that I could get through it.
The Aqualung and a world record had put cave diving on the map, not just in Britain, but also throughout Europe. It had entered an exciting new phase. The contest between air and oxygen had been won. It seemed forever.